Here are some movies: Birdman, The Graduate, and Reservoir Dogs. What do they all have in common? They all more or less have similar roots: the French New Wave. The French New Wave was a French film movement that emerged in the late 1950s and lasted until the late 60s, alongside the very similar movement, the Left Bank. The French New Wave films are very experimental, almost like a fuck you to the traditional narrative films. It is often associated with the youth culture, and it is known for the blend of fiction and documentary filmmaking, its overt political themes, and its interest in art beyond cinema. There are many filmmakers who are associated with both movements, but today I want to talk about Agnes Varda, who was later considered the mother of the French New Wave. Agnes Varda made a lot of movies during her lifetime in which she focuses a lot on people's characters, feminism, political and societal issues, and she did it in a way of blending fiction and documentary filmmaking to capture that realism. Many of her films are shot on location, handheld, and interestingly, a lot of it is just her with a digital camera on the street. She also developed a theory called the cinecriture, which literally means cinematic writing, in which she sees the camera as the pen and the director as the author. That is what gave her filmography their unique and standout feel and atmosphere. I mean, she didn't even study film. She was a photographer who had a vision for moving pictures, and it shows in her work. Cinecriture sounds very abstract, but after watching all of Varda's films, except for 5 because I couldn't find them anywhere, I gained a much better understanding of it. By the way, to my defense, I don't need those 5 to understand her as a filmmaker. Like I said, she made a lot of features. Besides those 5, there are another 18, which I watched all of them. She also made a lot of short films in between and also directed some television work, but this video will mostly focus on her features. So for the third episode of the Filmmaker Spotlight, I will shine in on Agnes Varda, her filmography, influence, and character as a human. And as always, no spoilers, of course. To start with her feature debut, La Pointe Courte in 1955, which was considered to be the forerunner of French New Wave. It was shot in the south of France with only 2 professional actors since they didn't have much money. Everything else, she gathered stories from the participants and weaved it into her script. The screenplay is divided into 2 major sections, one in which we follow a group of fishermen and the villagers as they go about day-to-day life, and the other we follow a couple who are struggling if they want to stay together. These 2 storylines have nothing in common other than the fact that they take place in the same place. This is a village where Varda's family lived for a few years, and this debut can also work as a love letter as the camera moves through the alleyways and lingers on the laundry lines. In fact, Varda also put some of the participants' name in the opening credit because some of these stories of the villagers are actually their real life experiences. Like the man Raphael, who is basically reenacting his own story when he was young. La Pointe Courte emphasizes on the village, the villagers within, and the work they do. That's why sequences feel so disjointed. The audience is almost looking at the film through a telescope as Varda captures moment by moment from the fishermen to the parents to the mothers and the children. This extends to the sound of the film as well. As characters walk away from the camera, the dialogue doesn't fade away, it stays very much in the forefront. It acknowledges that these sequences are fictional. We get a lot of jump cuts to signal ideas for these scenes, and a lot of it I feel is just inner dialogue spoken out loud. Like I said, Varda started off as more of a photographer than a filmmaker, and you can definitely see the composition is all of her work's highlights. And the more you get into it, the more you feel these shots creeping behind your back because there's always a rhythm. Her films are always breathing. This can be as simple as literally separating 2 characters until they meet at the end, or an atmospheric setting with unique lighting and shadows. La Pointe Courte can really be boiled down to a piece of visual emotion. 7 years later, Varda made her second feature, Cléo from 5 to 7. This is the film that got me binging her work, right? Like I said in the Day 30 quarantine watch list video, Cléo from 5 to 7 is one of the most beautiful looking black and white films I may have ever seen, and probably my favorite Varda film of all. Cléo from 5 to 7 follows a young singer, Cléo, who awaits her medical test results as we follow her on a real-time journey from 5 to technically 6:30, but it's a very interesting choice once you walk out of this one. The film is exactly 90 minutes long, divided by chapters, and the length of each chapter depends on how many minutes for each set piece to take place. Again, the film can be separated into 2 major sections, the first half and the second half, both exactly 45 minutes long. And I loved it. Varda wanted to hit those time cues so precisely, she counted the shots by seconds, and because it takes place in real time, many shots are completed without any cuts, like Cléo walking down the 10 steps of stairs leading to her every step across the yard. Most of them are shot on location, and you can kind of see a lot of pedestrians staring at the camera, which I find it pretty funny. Not only the timing, the camera movements are so precise too. The film gains so much depth from it. Cléo from 5 to 7 was made around the time of the Algerian War, and it is heavily influenced by that, specifically towards the end of the film, when it questions the meaning of war and people's existentialism. It captures women's stereotype and how they are viewed by men as we walk down the street with her minute by minute. And once the film fades to black, every single choice made becomes so apparent. Whether it's the runtime, the title, the structure, or the fact that she shot the opening scene in color but never again for the entire film, everything makes so much sense. Varda set out to capture two things: objective time and subjective time, and whatever that means is up to you to explore. 3 years later, Varda put out Happiness, which is about a husband falling for another woman, and I think the film is quite self-explanatory because it questions what happiness truly means, specifically how differently it is interpreted by different people, and everyone has a different version of happiness in their head. That aspect, I think, is the most fascinating part of it. For you, happiness might mean having a family and people who love you around you. To Varda herself, happiness may mean colors, where instead of fading to black, she fades to different colors every time. It is a very colorful film, both literally and figuratively. The film was quite controversial because many said that this film is a feminist critique because of, quote, presence of rage and pain under a surface of the loveliest color, end quote. Happiness opened up so many different interpretations. It's actually kind of cool. Even way after, in the early 1990s, I believe that was about 30 years after its initial release, there are people who interpreted the film as the representation of male privilege, and Varda was so happy that the film caused so much discussion, she just sat back and didn't even bother to come out and say what her intent was, though she did deny some of the interpretations. Angrily, because the ending was so shocking and unexpected. I would argue it is unexpected from the get-go when she jump cuts the sunflowers. Fragmental editing is ubiquitous throughout most of her films. I think it's an interesting piece to think about, mainly from many different perspectives, and from a technical standpoint, this is the film Varda clearly showed her impeccable instinct when it comes to filmmaking, and whatever she wants to say just seeps through automatically. 1 year later, she made The Creatures, which was her only attempt at a little element of science fiction. I don't want to reveal too much of the plot. All you have to know is it is about a couple. One communicates through writing and the other is working on a novel. Through this unique vision, Varda said her piece regarding inspirations. And I got an undertone about free will, the existence of God, and outside forces as well. There's also a lot of sequences in which the film turns red, which I thought is a very violent, in-your-face way of realizing fiction and reality. The premise of the film is very interesting, but it was overall a commercial failure. It didn't make much money. However, Varda turned failure around in a really cool and awesome way, and we'll talk about that by the end of the video, but I promise it's very cool. In 1969, Varda made Lion's Love and Lies, and this has gotta be one of the weirdest films I've ever seen. It's this weird, extremely experimental and meta film about a filmmaker going to Hollywood trying to get a film produced, but Agnes Varda herself is also trying to document the process by following 3 hippies performers who simultaneously acknowledge Varda's existence and camera, yet we're watching the film in a perspective in which the camera doesn't exist. So, long story short, I'm very confused. I saw this review online saying that this is Varda's version of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and in so many ways, he is so right. Lion's Love focuses on stardom, celebrity cultures, performances, and reflexivity. It blurs the line between reality and fiction. To do that, the film isn't just about filmmaking, it's also about other mediums as well. Since I probably can't explain it any better, I'll just quote Varda herself. It's a collage of what happened to me in Hollywood in 1968. I was in Hollywood when McClure's play opened. I was there when Kennedy's assassination happened. I watched it all on TV. There I met Viva, and the only movies I saw in Hollywood I liked were Andy Warhol's movies. End quote. Television and the camera are themselves characters in the film, thus creating this meta-ness. It is a film who construct and destruct simultaneously, and it is also a film who creates a reality and destroys it simultaneously. That's why it's so hard to explain it. It's like a movie within a movie, but also it's not. Here, I found an even better explanation. This will be the pitch, and we'll leave this one afterwards. Lion's Love is about a filmmaker, Shirley Clarke, attempting to get a film produced. It is also about Varda, the film's director, directing Shirley Clarke, also a director, to play the role of a director, a role which Varda assumes herself at one point in Lion's Love, the film she is directing. The film features a trio of established underground stars trying to become bigger stars by playing versions of themselves who are also trying to become stars, and eventually talking directly to the camera. Do I think it worked? Probably not. And there's nothing complicated about it, so let's move on. There's another time jump after that. We fast forward 6 years. In 1975, Varda made a little documentary titled something something something. I still don't know how to pronounce it. It was originally made for television, but was later screened in film festivals for how well made it was. With that in mind, the film didn't have much money either, and so there's limited option when it comes to shooting. On top of that, this is around the time when Varda just had her second child, so she decided to make this documentary about the people and shops on the street she used to live in Paris. Again, since there's not much money involved, Varda decided to utilize her own electricity from her own house, which was on that street. She pulled a power cord from her house and uncoiled it. It was about 80 meters long, so she made this film within that distance. That way she solved the electricity problem, and also she can take care of her son easily. I mean, this story alone says so much about Agnes Varda as a human and as an artist. She also sees the 80 meters long cord as the umbilical cord that attached her and her work to her home. The documentary is very simple. Varda chose people in town to follow, mostly in shops like bakery, a butcher's, a grocery, to a small driving school. It, again, illuminates people's day-to-day action, but there's a twist, specifically in the latter half of the film when a magician is introduced into the mix. And the way Varda cuts between scenes from the action of one person in one place to another is something so extraordinary and unique that reveals deeper truth, which is what the central theme of the film is. She was able to somehow make connections between seemingly unrelated events. I think it's genius. It's one of my favorites of hers. If anything, see this one too. It is very personal. It's just a love letter with so much heart behind it. 2 years later, in 1977, Varda made her loudest and most political feature to date. One sings, the other doesn't. Varda turned her camera to politics and told a story through the lens of a feminist who tries to be heard. We follow two women and their story against the backdrop of the women's movement in the 70s in France. It mostly deals with abortion and the idea of my body, my decisions. Even though the film, as Varda said, is 99.5% against women, it never felt stingy and untasteful like many political movies today. Maybe a little too on the nose, sure, but the visuals and imageries are so specific and sometimes very brutal as well. The film left on a note of which you feel it lingers because the issues live on forever and for how many generations that may come. It happens to everybody, whether you sing or you don't. In 1981, Varda put out two films, one documentary, Mural Murals, and one a docudrama, Documenteur. These two are considered companion pieces since they have the same backdrop, and the latter starts with exactly the last shot of the former. They both take place in Los Angeles. Mural Murals deals with Varda interviewing muralists and talking about their work and inspiration. On top of that, she set out to gather each corner of the city, however contrasting that may be. And this goes beyond just the artwork. Varda doesn't shy away from stories that are violent like gang affiliation. Yes, it is political, but what isn't really? Following that is Documenteur. It is a docudrama that shifts from fiction to documentary every once in a while. It starts right where Murals left off, and many artwork you see in Murals, you can also see it here. It stars our own son, Matthew Demy, and we follow a single mother who struggles to get her life together. I can draw a lot of parallel to Varda herself since this film spent a big chunk of its time shooting by the beach, and in Varda's world, it is inspiration. These two work as companion pieces because it is a love letter to the city. However, they also illustrate two sides of the same coin: the color and energy presented in Murals and the dark and ruthless corners in Documenteur. 4 years later, in 1985, Varda made Vagabond, probably my second favorite of hers for now. A lot of people compare it and draw similarities with Citizen Kane or Sunset Boulevard. We follow Mona, who is a vagabond, on her journey as she goes from places to places. Along the way, she meets different people. And here's what's unique about the narrative. Varda would insert these interviews of the people she just stumbled across in between sequences, and as the story goes on, you find that everyone has a different angle on Mona and everyone thinks differently about her. The film is told in a non-chronological order in that way, and it paints a very intriguing portrait of a simple yet complex character because, after all, she becomes a rumor that means different things to everyone she meets. This is the film that made me rethink every single Varda film because this is the film where I finally understood what cineculture really means. It is intimate and incredibly distinctive, and when you really understand what Varda is doing here, everything seems so obvious. There are exactly 13 tracking shots in the film, all lasting for 1 minute, and each of them are spaced out about 10 minutes away from each other. Vagabond is a dance and there's a rhythm to it. Each tracking shot starts with a local element or an object as Mona enters the frame and walks from right to left because it is the opposite the way we read, which is from left to right, therefore creating this jarring and uncomfortable feeling psychologically. It is a portrait in which the audience and the camera truly walks with the character. After the 1 minute, the camera usually comes to a halt and Mona exits the frame, leaving no trace behind. It's genius. I wouldn't recommend this to be your first Varda film though. I think La Pointe Courte or Cléo from 5 to 7 is a better entry point, but this is just genius. In 87 and 88, Varda put out another 2 films, one a docudrama and another fiction, and they also work as companion pieces together. Jane B by Agnes V is a portrait of the singer-actor Jane Birkin when she turned 40 in real life. It started with Varda hearing her complain about the age and then saying how 40 is the most beautiful age for women. They did this portrait to explore Jane's past and roles they would like to see her play. It is very hypnotizing and I think is probably the most beautiful looking documentary Varda has made. With shots like this, how can you not love it? Other than that, I really enjoy the introspection. There's a scene in which Jane pitches her idea for a script to Varda, and that script turned into Kung Fu Master, which came out later. Kung Fu Master starred Jane herself and Varda's own son again, and it's not about what you think, I promised. It explores a relationship between 2 people who have a huge age gap, and they did it in the most poetic way possible. Like, that ending really hit me. It's really a simple story, simply told. Again, I really enjoy the introspection in these sister films. These 2 films are very vulnerable, especially coming from the perspective of a middle-aged woman who is going through some existential crisis and midlife crisis. It's fascinating and beautiful. Highly recommend the Jane B portrait. It's on YouTube, you can just go watch it. In 1991, Jacquot was premiered. It was a film dedicated to Varda's husband, Jacques Demy. Unfortunately, Demy passed right before that. It is a film that talks about Demy's childhood as a cinephile who wants to make films against all odds. Demy wrote the script for the most part, but when he finished, he said he didn't have much energy to make it from his illness. That's why Varda took the project. It shines a light on Demy's inspiration as a filmmaker, so there are many imagery or scenes that are shot dramatically for the film, and Varda would intersplice it with Demy's work, so we get to see the relation and parallel. Sometimes Demy would show up on set and say how accurate Varda captured his childhood. There are a lot of things shown here that remind me of myself when I was a kid and make me rejoice. Following that, The World of Jacques Demy in 1995 was also a tribute to her late husband. This one focuses more on his actual work than his inspiration. I think it's a good look at his career over time, and it is also surprisingly political and childlike at the same time. Also, Harrison Ford was in it. He gave an interview about one of his earliest work, which is really cool. Moving on to the 2000s, The Gleaners and I was a documentary about the people who pick up leftover goods in farms and markets. Varda took us on this journey with her digital camera as we explore the morals and philosophy behind waste and gleaning. I love how she also explores some people who are not forced to glean. You would expect people who glean are the people who are having financial troubles, but there's actually a whole way of life behind it. There's also a subplot about a clock without hands and some heart-shaped potatoes she took home to photograph, which is a reoccurring object in her later films. I know, it's awesome, isn't it? I think it's super cute. Varda is the only documentarian, or filmmaker for that matter, who can show us a lens cap dangling from her camera for a minute straight with music in the background and call it the dance of the lens cap, because she forgot to turn her camera off and get away with it. There's one point in the film where Varda starts rapping out of nowhere. I loved it. She also made a follow-up called The Gleaners and I 2 years later, which I couldn't find anywhere. So let's fast forward again to 2008 when she put out The Beaches of Agnes. It is an autobiographical essay about her career, her work, as she revisits places from her past while celebrating her 80th birthday. She intended this to be her last film but made another 2 a decade later, and for that reason this film is very similar to her actual final work, so I won't say much here. A decade later, in 2017, Varda and JR, a photographer slash street artist, put out Faces Places. It was nominated for the Best Documentary Feature for the Oscars that year, and it is probably my favorite documentary of hers. It's just such a delightful movie. We follow Varda and JR around France, where they create portraits of people they come across, and the further it went on, I feel like the better it got, especially how they ended the whole thing. I definitely got emotional towards the end. Please see this one, it's incredible. And finally, we are here. In 2019, just last year, Varda put out her last film, Varda by Agnès. We've come a long way, my friend. Again, it is an autobiographical essay about her career and past work. I like this more than The Beaches of Agnès because I think it's a lot more focused, and because we have this one, the previous one kind of gets pushed down a little bit by comparison, just in my opinion. I would definitely recommend watching Varda by Agnès last because it's a self-reflection, and this is probably the best film she could have left with. When asked if this was made to stop time like the clock without hands in The Gleaners and I, Varda responded that it wasn't. It was made to accompany time. Agnes Varda passed away last year in March of 2019 at the age of 90. Her work is often very political and internal. As the frontrunner of the French New Wave, Varda had inspired many filmmakers that came after. Her outlook to the world was childlike, unique, personal, and completely innovative. She didn't grow up a cinephile. Apparently, she only watched about 10 films before the age of 25. That's why her body of work feels so out of the box. I absolutely adore her both as a filmmaker and as a human. This is a person who dyed her hair that way just because she likes colors. You can see her cat Zagugu in I think almost every film in the beginning as a homage. She also did some really cool things when her cat passed away. Remember I said she did something really awesome with the commercial failure of the film The Creatures? Well, the awesomeness also extends to other films such as Lion's Love and Happiness. I want to cover it here, but I think it's probably better for you to watch it yourself. Just keep in mind what she did with the film strips was inspired by the Gleaners she met in the documentary The Gleaners and I, which gives the whole thing a brand new meaning: to recycle. So I will leave 2 secret links in the description. I think if you're still watching this video by this point, you're probably interested in Varda as a filmmaker. So there are 2 secret links in the description, both YouTube videos. I think they're very fun to get to know her. Also, the Criterion Collection is going to release the Agnes Varda set in the upcoming August, which includes all 39 of her features, shorts, and docs combined in a 15-disc Blu-ray box. So perfect time to order that shit, boy. Plus, a little plug, if you want to know my personal ranking of all her films, I made a Letterboxd account. I'll also put the link in the description. Varda loves to point her camera to regular people because they are the best teller for their stories. She is really the embodiment of how we don't see the world as it is, we see it as we do. Varda also continually reinvent herself as an artist over the decades. She made many installations in museums as well. I want to leave this episode with a little story. Rewind back to her feature debut, Pointe Courte. Because very little money was involved, she picked up some 16mm strips and shot the first draft of the film. Varda grabbed her friend Suzu and Suzu's husband Pierrot to play the demo version of the couple. Before the final cut, Pierrot passed away. Afterwards, Suzu raised their 2 sons. Years later, as a tribute, Varda gathered the demo reels and showed it to them, so they could see their father in a moving picture rather than a still for the first time in their lives.